God's chosen ones. Which of these 9 types carries your divine assignment? What if your loneliness wasn't punishment, but prophecy? What if the silence in your life was heaven's way of preparing you to carry a voice the world needed to hear? You weren't made to fit the mold, because you were crafted for a mission. And no, you're not crazy for sensing the shift, the separation, the ache. You're not broken, you're becoming. Because God doesn't just call the visible. He anoints the invisible, the hidden ones, the sacred ones, the 9 types who were born for more. If you're one of God's chosen, then this message was written in heaven with your name on it. The blueprint in her bones. Grace had always carried questions she couldn't name. Long before she understood the language of purpose or pain, there was simply deceit. A weight, not heavy, like sorrow, but holy, like something she didn't earn and couldn't shake. As a child, she used to stare at the ceiling long after the lights went out, wondering why her dreams felt like warnings, why she saw things in people that they hadn't spoken, why her heart would pound when she entered rooms where no words had been said, but secrets hung thick in the air. They called her sensitive, emotional, overthinking. She called it torment. Until now, on a night when the wind howled like prophecy and her chest burned with questions too old for her voice, she found herself kneeling, not to beg, but to surrender. "I don't want to be seen," she whispered. "I just want to understand why I was made like this." No answer came. Only silence, thick, sacred, sobering. But she'd learned by now, when heaven is silent, it's listening hardest. And in that silence, something stirred. A flicker behind her eyes. Memory? No, a reminder. That dream she had at 7, the one she tried to forget. A voice in the night had said, "You will carry 9 names. Each one will feel like fire, but I gave them to you for a reason." Back then it sounded like a fairy tale, now it felt like thunder in her blood. Because here she was, grown, tired, battle-worn. And the fire inside her hadn't gone out. It had matured. It had waited. She began to name the feelings that chased her through life like shadows. The knowing that arrived before events did. The refusal to stay silent when truth was bleeding in the room. The dreams. The solitude. The ache for people she hadn't even met. And suddenly, it made sense. She wasn't lost, she was in formation. She wasn't fragile, she was marked. She wasn't behind, she was becoming. All along, the blueprint hadn't been outside of her. It was in her bloodstream, her story, her survival. And if you felt this too, the sacred ache, the strange knowing, the pressure that can't be explained, maybe you're not like the rest either. Maybe you weren't sent here to blend. Maybe heaven assigned you to build, to break what needed breaking, to carry what no one else could. Because the chosen aren't chosen by applause. They're chosen by fire, and if that sounds familiar, then maybe, just maybe, you've already started living one of the 9 names heaven gave only to the rare. Part 1. The Oracle. She knew before it broke. Grace was 9 years old when it started. It wasn't the dreams themselves that frightened her. It was the accuracy. The way she would dream of someone falling and then hear the news the next day. The way she'd see her mother crying in a vision days before the shouting match ever happened. It wasn't imagination. It was something else. Something that made her eyes feel too old for her face. She tried telling her mother once. After the 3rd dream about her father's truck crashing into the ditch, Grace finally spoke. "I saw it last night," she whispered over breakfast. "Dad's truck. The blue one. It was upside down. Her mother paused mid-sip. "What are you talking about, Grace?" "I saw it," she said, slower this time. The road was wet, the brakes didn't work, but her mother only smiled tightly and said something about too much TV. That was a Thursday. By Sunday afternoon, her father limped through the front door with a busted lip and a total truck. No one talked about the dream. No one even looked her in the eyes that night. That's how it always went. She would speak, things would happen, people would look away. Eventually, she learned to stop speaking. By the time she was 17, Grace had stopped calling them dreams. They weren't fuzzy or whimsical, they were loud, heavy, like warnings wrapped in velvet. She'd walk into rooms and feel the betrayal in someone's laugh. She'd sit near a stranger and suddenly know they were grieving someone who had passed just last week. She didn't know how she knew, she just did. She'd whisper things to herself that later became truth. She felt atmospheres bend. She felt the air shift. Before the news ever came. But every time she tried to tell someone, even church folks, they'd shift uncomfortably in their seats. Tell her she was too intense. That she needed to pray it away. So she stopped telling them too. But she never stopped knowing. It was years later, after a broken engagement and a night spent sobbing on her bathroom floor, that the voice returned. The same voice from her childhood dreams. It didn't come loudly. It came like a whisper inside her bones. "You see because I made you that way. You feel before others do because you were meant to warn them, not to fit in." She sat up, tears still on her face, heart pounding with something other than pain. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel cursed by her knowing. She felt commissioned. And in that moment she understood. She was not just intuitive. She was not just emotional. She was an oracle. Oracles aren't loud. They don't beg to be seen. They weep quietly when no one listens. They pray when others mock. They carry insight that feels more like intercession than information. They are the ones heaven speaks to early, not to torment them, but to prepare them. Because oracles aren't just seers. They're warning bells. They're atmosphere shifters. They're spiritual antennas in human skin. And it's no coincidence you feel everything before anyone says a word. It's not weakness that your heart breaks for things no one else sees yet. It's because your soul was tuned to a frequency that isn't of this world. And if you're still wondering why you just know, why people fear your silence more than your words, why you feel it before it happens, then maybe you're not broken. Maybe you're not paranoid. Maybe you're the oracle. And if that's true, then let me ask you, if you saw what was coming and no one believed you, would you still speak? Part 2. The Free Spirit. They called her rebellious, but heaven called her unbound. Grace never did like rules. Not because she wanted chaos, but because the rules always seemed too small for the truth she carried. She asked too many questions in Sunday school. Why do we sing but not weep? Why do we wear dresses but not carry compassion? She didn't mean to be difficult. She meant to understand. But adults rarely welcomed the kind of questions that made their doctrines tremble. By 14, she had a reputation, the rebellious girl. Not wild, not reckless, just unruly enough to sit in the back pew and cry when no one else was moved. Unruly enough to skip church one Sunday to sit under a tree and read Isaiah, because the tree felt more sacred than the sanctuary. They told her she was drifting, but Grace didn't feel lost. She felt unleashed. School was no different. Teachers wanted her obedient, not awake. Friends wanted her agreeable, not electric. And for a while she tried. She bit her tongue, she wore the dresses, she smiled on cue. But her soul began to wither. The more she tried to conform, the louder the ache inside her became. It wasn't rebellion, it was recognition. Recognition that she had been born for more than systems and silence. She didn't want to belong to the world. She wanted to belong to God, but not in the neat pastel-colored box people offered her. She wanted him raw, real, uncaged. And maybe that's why when she was 17 she ran, not from faith, but from the fence they tried to build around it. Grace spent years wandering, through cities and circles, through music and movement, through conversations with artists, misfits and mystics who didn't look like church people but carried more of God than some pulpits ever had. She didn't stop believing. She just stopped obeying what didn't feel holy. It was on a cross-country train, somewhere between nowhere and New Mexico, that it hit her. An old man sat across from her. Weathered hands, soft voice. Without looking up, he said, "You know, some birds never sing in cages. You weren't made to behave, you were made to awaken." Grace's eyes stung. She hadn't spoken a word to him. He smiled faintly and added, "Heaven never wanted your performance, just your pulse." Then she wept quietly into the train window, because for the first time in years, she didn't feel rebellious. She felt reclaimed. Free spirits aren't faithless. They just don't serve systems. They dance barefoot on the border between reverence and wildness. They ask questions because they care deeply, not because they doubt. And they were never meant to fit. They were meant to free. So if you've always felt allergic to the world's mold, if you've been punished for your questions, exiled for your joy, or shamed for your hunger for something more, then maybe you're not a failure. Maybe you're not disobedient. Maybe you're the free spirit, the one whose liberty is contagious, the one whose very presence reminds others what it means to breathe. And maybe heaven isn't asking you to calm down. Maybe it's asking you to keep moving, because your freedom is someone else's permission slip. Now let me ask you, if they told you to behave, but God told you to break the mold, who would you obey? Part 3. The truth teller. She lost their applause the moment she spoke the truth. Some people walk into a room and make everyone comfortable. Grace was not one of those people. She didn't mean to stir things, she simply couldn't lie. Not in her tone, not in her eyes, not in her silence. There were years when she tried. She tried to smile when her spirit groaned. She tried to nod along when something inside her screamed, "This isn't right." She tried to soften the edges of truth to keep the peace. But every time she withheld what needed to be said, something inside her fractured. The breaking point came in her late 20s. She was working in a non-profit, the kind with the glossy mission statement and hollow backbone. She discovered that funds meant for widows and struggling mothers were being funneled into luxury dinners and private flights for the board. She brought it up quietly. Then she brought it up more directly. And finally she stood in a board meeting, trembling but unwavering, and said, "If you won't fix it, I'll expose it." The room fell silent. And just like that, the same people who once called her a light began calling her divisive. The same hands that once applauded her passion now labeled her emotional. She was let go the next week. No severance, no goodbye cake, just silence and closed doors. She walked out of that building with nothing in her hands but peace in her bones, because the truth had cost her comfort but not her conscience. And that was the day she stopped seeking approval. She wasn't here to impress. She was here to interrupt. The truth tellers are never the favorites. They're the ones who speak when silence is profitable. They're the ones who refuse to smile when injustice demands applause. They carry the kind of honesty that makes rooms shift, hearts pound, and masks fall off. They're the ones you remember, not because they were pleasant, but because they were prophetic. Grace learned that truth doesn't need to shout to be sharp. It doesn't need to be cruel to be clear. But it will always cost you something. A relationship, a job, Sprax's platform, a title, sometimes even your safety, but not your soul. Never your soul. And if you've ever stood trembling, knowing you could stay silent and be safe, but chose instead to speak and be sifted, then you know what it means to carry this fire, to feel the holy ache of inconvenient honesty, to walk away from applause just to stay aligned with heaven. Because you're not here to be popular. You're here to be pure. You're not here to tell people what they want to hear. You're here to say what sets captives free. So let me ask you, if your truth cost you everything, would you still speak it? Part 4. The Inspiring Infiltrator. Title. She didn't preach, but people awakened anyway. Grace never liked microphones. She wasn't a stage person, didn't shout, didn't try to lead. She simply created poems scribbled on coffee-stained napkins, songs sung into her cracked iPhone at 2:13 a.m., brushstrokes across canvases that looked like worship set free. She didn't aim to inspire, she aimed to survive. Art was the way her soul exhaled when the world got too loud. But slowly, quietly, her whispers started turning lights on in others. It began with one post, a 3-lick poem. Soft, honest, raw. She wrote it after a night of tears that no one saw. Posted it without makeup, no hashtags, no filters. Went to sleep. By morning, a stranger had shared it, then another, and another. Until one day, 350 people had, and tucked between the likes and shares was a message from a woman she had never met. I was about to end it last night, but your words made me pause. I think God spoke through you. Grace froze, stared at the screen, and wept. Not because she felt proud, but because she realized heaven had been using her paintbrush all along. She had always felt invisible in church, too quiet to be noticed, too artsy to be spiritual, but God hadn't overlooked her. He had simply assigned her to a different kind of pulpit, a pulpit of color and rhythm and subtlety. Inspiring infiltrators don't lead movements from megaphones. They hide truth in melodies. They smuggle hope into Instagram captions. They infuse courage into choreography. They embed resurrection into fashion, film, and photography. They preach without preaching. Their altar is beauty. Their offering is subtle disruption. Their fruit, awakened hearts who never saw it coming. Grace never said, "Let me change the world." She said, "Let me feel again." And in her healing, she unknowingly healed others. If you've ever felt like your gift was too gentle to matter, if you've ever doubted that art could be anointed, if you've quietly poured your soul into something and wondered, is this even ministry? Then maybe you're not a background character. Maybe you're heaven's secret weapon. Maybe you're the inspiring infiltrator, sent not to shout, but to stir, not to confront, but to call forth, not to tear down, but to wake up what's been sleeping. So let me ask you, if God gave you influence wrapped in beauty, would you still use it, even if no one clapped? Part 5. The confused chosen one. She knew she was called, but had no map. Grace had always known she was different, but knowing you're different doesn't tell you what to do with it. She had seen things, felt things, spoken words that later echoed in real life. She'd been confirmed by strangers, encouraged by dreams, and chased by a purpose that felt too big for her hands. And yet, she still felt lost. There were mornings she'd wake up with a burning in her bones and no direction to aim it. Nights she'd cry because she knew there was something more, but heaven hadn't sent the blueprint. It was like standing on a mountain of potential, staring into fog. She tried ministry. It felt hollow. She tried entrepreneurship. It felt forced. She tried silence. That felt worse. Everyone around her seemed so sure. Their paths were clean, their steps steady. Meanwhile, Grace kept circling, waiting for a go that never came. Her heart was full of yes, but her life looked like maybe. And that ache, that gap between calling and clarity, nearly crushed her. She'd sit in worship services where the preacher said, "If you don't know your purpose, you're not praying hard enough." She wanted to scream. Because she had prayed, fasted, wept. She had begged heaven for clarity. But what do you do when your ears are open and God is still quiet? Then came the dream. In it, she stood in a hallway with 9 closed doors. Each one pulsed with light behind it. She didn't know which to open. And a voice, that same voice from her childhood, whispered, "They're all yours, but not all yet. Walk with me, and I'll show you when." She woke up sobbing, not because she had all the answers, but because for the first time she knew her confusion wasn't disobedience. It was process. Confused chosen ones aren't failing. They're forming. They're the ones who feel the weight of destiny but don't yet know how to carry it. They read prophetic words that sound familiar but can't figure out how to live them. They carry oil but haven't yet found the altar. They have wings but keep bumping into ceilings. Ray stopped trying to force it, stopped rushing her revelation, stopped comparing her pace to those who were already building. She began, beholding, listening, resting. And one day, as she journaled under a tree, a stranger passed and said, "Whatever you're becoming, it's working. I felt peace just sitting near you." She didn't reply. She just smiled, because she was finally understanding. You don't need a title to carry a tremor. You don't need a platform to shift the atmosphere. Sometimes the most powerful people on earth are still trying to find the door. So if you've ever felt stuck in between, if you've known too much to go back, but not enough to move forward, if you felt like heaven called your name but forgot to give you the map, maybe you're not late. Maybe you're not lazy. Maybe you're the confused chosen one. And maybe confusion is just calling in disguise. So let me ask you, if you never got a sign, would you still follow the whisper? Part 6. The Hermit. She wasn't hiding, she was healing. After all the noise, Grace disappeared. Not dramatically, not out of anger, just quietly. She turned off her phone for days at a time, stopped going to events, stopped answering questions, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel guilty about it. She moved into a small cabin her aunt left her near the edge of a forest. No TV, no deadlines, no one asking for prayer at midnight. It wasn't escape. It was obedience. Because sometimes, when heaven wants to recalibrate you, it takes you away from what you thought you needed. At first, the silence was deafening. Her thoughts were loud, the questions came harder, the memories, some joyful, some jagged, started rising like smoke from a fire she didn't remember lighting. But she stayed, and eventually the stillness began to sing. Birdsong replaced sermons, and in the trees preached louder than any preacher. She learned to watch how the sun shifted the shadows. She started talking to God, not with desperation, but with rhythm. No begging, just being. The world called her missing, but heaven called her maturing, because the hermit doesn't isolate to avoid people. They withdraw to remember the voice they were created to hear. There, in that cabin, Grace learned the art of emotional mastery. She sat with her anger, her ache for others, and instead of judging them, she listened to them. She cried over losses she never mourned, laughed over memories she thought she'd forgotten, and heard God say things he'd never say in a crowd. "You don't have to perform for me," he whispered. "You're my daughter, even in your silence." Hermits are not weak. They are watchmen. They stand between realms. They guard what others overlook. And when they finally speak, they do so with the force of 100 unspoken sermons. They are not absent. They are anchored. They are not invisible. They are interceding. They are not bitter. They are becoming. So if you've ever found yourself suddenly pulling away, craving quiet when others crave clout, longing for nature more than noise, chosen the back pew over the front spotlight, then maybe you're not depressed. You're not disconnected. Maybe you're the hermit, and heaven chose you to carry silence like a sword. So let me ask you, if no one ever saw your transformation, would it still be worth it? Part 7. The Warrior. She didn't want the fight, but the fight found her anyway. Grace never asked for war. She didn't grow up dreaming of spiritual battles or carrying swords forged in prayer. She only wanted peace. Peace in her mind. Peace in her home. Peace in her soul. But peace, she discovered, is not something you inherit. It's something you contend for. And when darkness tried to settle round the people she loved, Grace found herself rising with a fire she didn't know she had. It started when a close friend, a young mother, confided in her about the abuse she was enduring, the kind no one believed, because the bruises weren't on her skin, they were in her silence. Grace offered to help, offered to speak up, and the moment she did, the enemy showed up. Sudden attacks on her finances, her car vandalized, false accusations at work. Even her own pastor pulled her aside and said, "Maybe you should stay quiet. This is messy. Let the authorities handle it." But Grace couldn't, because when God puts a sword in your hand, staying silent is no longer holiness, it's disobedience. So she spoke, loudly, clearly, righteously, and the backlash came like a tidal wave. But so did the miracles. That same friend escaped, found shelter, found hope, and eventually found her voice. She found out she was a warrior, not because she won every battle, but because she showed up for them. Warriors aren't always the loudest in the room. Sometimes they're the ones weeping behind closed doors after standing firm for someone else. They don't fight because they love conflict. They fight because they love truth. They fight for the oppressed, for the silenced, the ones who have no one else. And when darkness knocks, they don't cower. They confront. Grace learned that her tears were not weakness, they were weapons. Her prayers weren't empty words, they were missiles in the spirit. The discernment wasn't paranoia, it was intel from heaven. And though she bore scars from every battle, she wore them like medals, proof that she did not back down. So if you've ever found yourself standing alone in rooms where truth was being buried, if you've spoken when silence was safer, fought when others fled, carried others when your own knees trembled, then maybe you weren't overreacting. Maybe you weren't too intense. Maybe you were activated. Because you, dear soul, are the warrior. And the reason you've been attacked so often is because the enemy knew who you were before you did. So let me ask you, if the fight was never fair, but still yours to win, would you show up anyway? Part 8. The Healer. She touched people without laying a hand. Grace had always been drawn to broken things. not out of pity, but out of knowing. She recognized fracture like a second language, because she too had once been in pieces. That's why she noticed the cashier whose smile trembled, the neighbor who stopped planting flowers after her husband died, the pastor's wife who laughed but never really looked happy. Grace didn't heal with dramatic signs or spotlight prayers. She healed with her presence, with food that felt like communion, with conversations that made people cry before they understood why, with questions that unlocked rooms inside people they had long sealed shut. Her journey into healing didn't start in a ministry. It started in a grocery aisle. A woman dropped a jar of olives. Glass shattered. The woman panicked. People walked around her. Grace knelt beside her. The woman was shaking. Grace held her hand and whispered, "You're not clumsy. You're carrying too much." The woman broke, right there between the pickles and the pasta. From then on, Grace knew. Healing wasn't always about laying on hands. It was about lifting burdens. She studied herbal remedies, learned how food affects the soul, started small, teas and tonics. People called it quirky, but they kept coming back, not just for the drink, but for the peace. And when someone said you should open a wellness center, she smiled and said, "I already did. It's called my kitchen." Healers don't chase titles. They become safe places. They don't diagnose, they discern. They don't point out pain, they sit in it with you until it starts to lift. They understand that healing isn't just physical. It's spiritual, emotional, atmospheric. They know that sometimes just showing up is surgery. Grace began leaving notes on benches, little messages. "You are more than what hurt you. Drink water, breathe deeply. You're still here. And that matters." She didn't sign them. She didn't need credit. She just wanted hearts to exhale. And if you've ever felt compelled to restore, not for fame, not for thanks, but because something in you aches when others suffer, if you've ever felt joy watching someone else remember their worth, then maybe your medicine isn't medicine. Maybe you are the medicine. You, dear soul, might be the healer, not because you fixed everyone, but because you showed them they weren't broken beyond repair. So, let me ask you, if no one ever knew your name, but a heart still healed because of you, would it be enough? Part 9. The Elder. She didn't grow old, she grew eternal. By the time Grace turned 67, her hands bore more stories than her journals. Wrinkles where rivers of mercy had flowed, scars where battles had been fought and forgiven, eyes that no longer looked for the spotlight because they had seen glory. She didn't call herself wise, but when she entered a room, silence followed like a student eager to learn. Not because she demanded respect, but because her presence carried the weight of what she had endured without becoming bitter. She no longer rushed to give advice. She asked questions instead, all the kind of questions that reached into your soul and pulled the truth out gently. Where does it still hurt? What lie are you still believing about yourself? What if the delay wasn't denial, but divine development? People came to her not for steps, but stillness. Not for answers, but alignment. Young women called her Mama Grace. Young men called her safe. She called them heaven's harvest, and she treated every story like sacred ground. Grace never published a book, but her life was one. Each chapter written in obedience, each sentence kissed with surrender, each page soaked in the ink of trial and trust. She had buried loved ones, been misunderstood, been overlooked, but never once, not once, had she been forsaken. And that's what she taught. You are never as forgotten as you feel. God doesn't waste groaning, he builds greatness with it. Elders don't compete, they cover. They don't dominate, they disciple. They don't speak to be heard, they speak to heal. They've tasted bitter seasons and turned them into sweet oil. They've lived long enough to see God's no turn into an unseen yes. They are heaven's anchor, the last to be noticed, but the first to be trusted when the storm rolls in. One afternoon, a girl named Ava came to sit with Grace on her porch. She was trembling, holding a worn journal and questions that weighed more than her years. "I don't know if I can carry all this," Ava whispered. Grace didn't rush to respond. She just looked her in the eyes, placed a trembling hand over hers, and said, "You already are, or heaven wouldn't have chosen you. So if you've ever felt like you've lived 10 lives in one, the of your wisdom came at a price most never saw. If people sit near you and somehow leave lighter, then maybe you're not just aging. Maybe you're the elder, the one heaven trusts to keep the fire burning. Not loudly, not theatrically, but faithfully. So let me ask you, if your legacy wasn't loud, but lasted, would it be enough for you? You were never just one thing. You were always all of heaven's whispered names. Maybe you didn't see yourself in just one of them. Maybe you saw yourself in all 9. Because God's chosen ones don't come wrapped in categories. They come wrapped in contradictions and anointing. You may be a truth teller on Monday, a healer by Wednesday, confused chosen one again by Thursday night, and that doesn't mean you're unstable. It means you're multidimensional, just like your maker. Grace learned that her story wasn't linear. She didn't climb from pain to purpose in a straight line. She spiraled upward, falling forward, stumbling into surrender, losing herself just in time to be found again. And in every season a different name of heaven surfaced in her. Oracle when she saw before others did. Free spirit when rules tried to cage her. Truth teller when silence felt like betrayal. Inspiring infiltrator when beauty became her pulpit. Confused chosen one when all she had was fog and a fragile yes. Hermit when solitude became sacred. Warrior when injustice crossed her threshold. Healer when peace flowed through her touch. Elder when her silence preached louder than sermons. And now, beloved, it's your turn. What have you carried in secret that only God could see? What roles have you worn without knowing they were holy? Because you were never just surviving. You were being prepared, marked, processed, refined, repeated, until the oil was ready to pour. Maybe you weren't chosen to be seen. Maybe you were chosen to sustain others in secret. Are you sure you're not one of the chosen, just because you haven't seen a miracle yet? Because sometimes the miracle is you still standing. If this story stirred something ancient in your soul, if you whispered, "That's me," more than once, then write in the comments, "I still stand by grace." Let it be your quiet roar, your testimony. Share this with someone who's been doubting their worth in the silence. And if you're ready for more sacred secrets, subscribe to the next story. It goes deeper, because your calling didn't end here. It's only just beginning.